Hello, Sunday School teachers, preachers, and students. Welcome to SundaySchoolPreacher.com. Listen, you need to get yourself a Moses on your side. This week's lesson is titled Faithful in Consequences, and God Forgives. I show in this week's lesson how Moses goes to bat for these unfaithful, rebellious, stiff-necked people. God is fed up and angry. Time after time, they've refused to believe God. Even after God has taken significant measures, created ways out of no ways, and miraculously delivered, provided for, and protected these people, they still won't believe God. God is angry. God is fed up, and God is ready to destroy the chosen people of Israel. But Moses pleads the case for these Israelites. Like a skillful lawyer, Moses recounts for God the words God told him in Exodus and reminds God of the love, mercy, and grace that God is known for. Moses reminds God that the Egyptians will say God destroyed them because God couldn't deliver them into the land of Canaan. God was ready to destroy the Israelites. But after Moses pleads the case, God changes God's mind. Instead of destruction, God chooses forgiveness. You need to get a Moses on your side. This week's lesson picks up exactly where last week ended. The spies have returned from their 40-day reconnaissance. They all report that the land flows with milk and honey, but only Joshua and Caleb say to invade the land immediately. The other 10 spies said, yes, the land flows with milk and honey, but there are giants that live in this land. In their bad report, they say that they are mere grasshoppers in the sight of these giants. They exaggerate, saying that even the land itself swallows up its inhabitants. They could see everything that God had done for them. They could see how bountiful the land was, but they could not see what God could do through them. As we continue in the theme of responding to God's faithfulness, this week I focus on faithful Moses advocating for an unfaithful Israel. Some of the ideas surrounding this week's text include the terms advocate and fidelity. Now, if you have Wi-Fi in your church Sunday school classroom or wherever you share this lesson, this channel is a good way to teach and discuss this week's lesson. What I provide is a concise overview of background, context, characters, themes, and topics that gets to the point, saves you time, and enhances your own teaching and study. If that's what you're looking for, you're in the right place. But the only way I know this is helpful is if you subscribe, click the like button, or say so in the comments. So please subscribe, like, comment, and then click the notifications bell so you'll be notified as soon as I upload next week's lesson. So with that said, welcome again to SundaySchoolPreacher.com, and let's go to work. So first we'll look at the background for today's text. So this text comes from Numbers, and Numbers deals with the Israelites wandering in the desert for 40 years. Moses is credited as the author of Numbers. The structure of Numbers revolves around two censuses taken to number the nation in preparation for invasion of the land of Canaan. The first census was taken in chapter 1, and the second census was taken in chapter 26. The first census numbered over 600,000 men. So this did not include women and children. And Nelson's Bible Handbook explains that if this is correct, the Israelite population would have been more than 2 million people. And historians note that this would have been an unusually high population for a nation state. Nelson's also notes one possible explanation is that the word translated thousands in English could have meant something like units, tenths, or clans in the Hebrew language. And if so, a much smaller number would have been in mind. The New Interpreter Study Bible explains that the English title refers to the many numbers contained in the two censuses, or the two census lists, that form the central pillars of the book's structure in chapters 1 and 26. So these censuses are central to the structure of the book. But the message of Numbers is the story of the old generation out of Egypt dying off as the new generation prepares to move into the promised land. The NISB also explains that the central narrative of Numbers is the spy story of chapters 13 and 14. These chapters narrate the theme of judgment and death for an old generation and birth and hope of a new generation of God's people. In these two chapters, we learn why the old generation lost the promised land and why the new generation would receive it. The old generation is beginning to show a pattern. Time after time, the generation that came out of Egypt fails to trust God. Because they fail to trust God, God eventually gets fed up of their rebellion and faithlessness. Now, to drill it down a little farther, in this 14th chapter, we see the importance of an advocate. It was Moses who spoke on behalf of the Israelites. God was fed up with God's own people. But because of the advocacy of Moses, instead of destroying these rebellious Israelites, God forgives them. This chapter opens with the congregation weeping aloud and complaining again against Moses and Aaron. Once again, they cry out in despair, wishing that they had died back in the land of their captivity. These are a people who have not learned that God is their provider, that God is their deliverer, and that God is their protector. With their faithlessness, we see in this chapter how the Israelites reject God, how God decides to destroy the Israelites, and how Moses changes God's mind, and how God ultimately forgives the Israelite nation. Some important words to consider from this text include advocacy and fidelity. So let's review last week and see how it connects to this week. Last week's lesson opened at chapter 13, verses 1 and 2, with the Lord speaking to Moses. I noted that the Lord instructs Moses to send men into the land of Canaan. This is the land that God promised Abraham. The promised land and the nation of Israel were hundreds of years in the making, but now the descendants of Abraham were on the verge of receiving the long-awaited promise. The text skips to verse 17a, where Moses sent the 12 spies into Canaan to explore the land and to determine its suitability for invasion. At verse 25, I noted that the spies have returned from their 40-day reconnaissance and how the number 40 is used quite often in the Bible. I also noted that we should not ascribe any more meaning to numbers than is necessary. We risk playing with occult numerology when giving more meaning to numbers than needed. Some occult practices include numerology, astrology, witchcraft, tarot cards, and others. In verse 26, the spies assembled at Kadesh in the desert of Paran to report their findings to Moses. To Moses, Aaron, and the whole assembly. In verse 27, the spies revealed that the land flowed with milk and honey. Not only did they tell of the goodness of the land, but they brought back evidence of the bountiful harvest that awaited on the other side. In verse 28, despite them seeing the bountiful blessing of the land, the spies report that the people were powerful and the cities were fortified and very large. I noted that the first census reported over 600,000 men, and historians record that this would have been an unusually large number of people because most nation states weren't that large at that time. So it seems that these spies, they see the blessings possible in the promised land. They see the powerful people, they see the large cities, but they don't see the fulfilled promise of God, nor do they see themselves as powerful in God's might. The text skips to chapter 14, verses 1 and 2, where the entire congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept that night. They wept because they believed the exaggerated report of the 10 spies. The New Interpreter's Bible One Volume Commentary explains that there are two versions of the spies' negative report. In the first version, the land flows with milk and honey. In the second version, verses 32 through 33 declare that the land itself is so bad that it eats its inhabitants. Additionally, the spies warn of giant Anakites and of a mythological and semi-divine race of giants known as the Nephilim. The Israelites see these giants and once again fall into fear. Instead of believing God, instead of believing that they were powerful and strong and brave, instead of believing that they were enough and that they had enough, they chose instead to believe the report of these men instead of the command of God. They were out of Egypt. They'd been delivered from enslavement by the mighty works and wonders of God. God had provided for them with manna in the morning and meat in the evening. God had turned bitter water into drinkable water. And even with all these miraculous works, they couldn't see how God would give them this promised land. Once again, they complain against Moses and Aaron. Once again, they wish that they had died in the land of Egypt or in the wilderness. And as they wept that night, God heard their cry. They cried out, not in faith, but in unfaithfulness. They didn't cry out in belief, but in unbelief. Theirs is not a cry of hope, but hopelessness. Although the old generation has seen the mighty works of God, this invasion, this conquest, is just a step too far for them to take. In verse 5, Moses and Aaron fall on their face before all the assembly. They realized what the Israelites were doing. They realized this entire nation is choosing to reject God even after all God had done for them. Verses 6 and 7 show Joshua and Caleb as the faithful few who believe God, who believe that God can and will do what God said God would do. They tear their clothes in frustration and declare again that the land they went through was an exceedingly good land. In verse 8, they explain that if the Lord is pleased with them, the Lord will give them this land that flows with milk and honey. In verses 9 and 10, Joshua and Caleb warn the Israelites not to rebel against the Lord and not to fear the people of the land. Instead of heeding the warning of Joshua and Caleb, the whole congregation threatened to stone them. The lesson this week is entitled, God Forgives and Faithful in Consequences. The scripture text comes from Numbers, the 14th chapter, verses 10b and 20. I'll read that text for you now from the New Revised Standard Version. We begin with a section entitled, The People Rebel. Then the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting to all the Israelites. And the Lord said to Moses, how long will this people despise me? And how long will they refuse to believe in me, in spite of all the signs that I've done among them? I'll strike them with pestilence and disinherit them, and I'll make of you a greater nation and mightier than they. The next section is entitled, Moses Intercedes for the People. Verse 13. But Moses said to the Lord, then the Egyptians will hear of it. For in your might you brought up this people from among them, and they will tell the inhabitants of this land. They have heard that you, O Lord, are in the midst of this people. For you, O Lord, are seen face to face, and your cloud stands over them, and you go in front of them in a pillar of cloud by day and in a pillar of fire by night. Now, if you kill this people all at one time, then the nations who have heard about you will say, it is because the Lord was not able to bring this people into the land he swore to give them, that he slaughtered them in this wilderness. And now, therefore, let the power of the Lord be great in the way that you promised when you spoke, saying, the Lord is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgression, but by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the parents upon the children to the third and fourth generation. Forgive the iniquity of this people according to the greatness of your steadfast love, just as you have pardoned this people from Egypt, even until now. Then the Lord said, I do forgive, just as you have asked. So what takes place in this passage? This week's lesson opens where last week's lesson closed. Last week, the Israelites rejected God's plan to take the land of Canaan. They complained against Moses and Aaron and wished to have died back in the land of captivity. Joshua and Caleb tore their clothes and reiterated how good the land was and that God would bless them if God was pleased with them. Verse 10a says, but the whole congregation threatened to stone them. Our lesson picks up at verse 10b. Then the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of the meeting to all the Israelites. The glory of God is defined as the divine essence of God, as absolutely resplendent and ultimately great. In other words, God is manifested at the tabernacle or the tent of meeting in a way that all the Israelites recognize as God. If all the Israelites could see this manifestation of God, it seems to me that that would have been enough to repent and turn to God in faithful obedience. In verse 11, the Lord speaks to Moses. The Lord questions, "How long will this people despise me? And how long will they refuse to believe in me in spite of all the signs that I've done among them?" God is angry with these Israelites. They've demonstrated that they despise God and refuse to believe in God despite God delivering them from the Egyptians, despite God allowing them to cross the Red Sea and drowning the Egyptian soldiers, despite God giving them water to drink and bread and meat to eat. Despite all of this, the Israelites are faithless, and God has had enough. Verse 12 shows just how angry God was. God says, "I will strike them with pestilence and disinherit them, and I will make of you a nation greater and mightier than they." To disinherit is to completely walk away from. It brings to mind the idea that you don't even want to see them anymore. God is ready to disinherit the people whom he promised Abraham would become a great nation and would number as many as the sand of the sea. At this point, you get the idea that God wants nothing more to do with this unfaithful, rebellious, stiff-necked people. God is fed up with the Israelites. In the same way God promised Abraham to make of him a great nation, now God tells Moses that God will make a great nation of him. In verse 13, Moses skillfully begins his advocacy for the Israelites. Moses, like a skillful lawyer defending a client, pleads his case with God. He begins by telling God, the Egyptians will hear of it. God had taken great care to deliver the descendants of Abraham from the Egyptians. In verse 14, Moses continues defending the Israelites, telling God, the Egyptians will tell the people of Canaan that their God was in the midst of them, seen face to face by them, and was with them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Moses is making the point to God that God has been present. God has been present in their deliverance, and that if they are abandoned or destroyed, now it'll be seen as if God could not keep them. The point Moses is making is that these are God's people. If the rest of the world sees them as defeated and wiped out, it'll reflect on God. In verses 15 and 16, Moses presses his point to God. He tells God, if you kill this people all at once, the nations who have heard about you will say it's because the Lord was not able to bring this people into the land he swore to give them. Not only that, but the reason God killed them was because God could not deliver them into the land. Moses is playing hardball with God. Moses pulls no punches. Moses is going to defend these Israelites with everything at his disposal. You need to get somebody like Moses on your side. Moses goes to bat for these unfaithful, rebellious, stiff-necked people with all of their faults and all of their failures. In verses 17 and 18, Moses goes as far as to remind God of what God said to him in the past. Moses quotes back to God what God said in Exodus 34, verses 1 through 9. Moses reminds God that God should be slow to anger and abounding in love. He reminds God that God does not clear the guilty, but visits upon them the iniquity of the parents upon the children for the third and fourth generations. In verses 19 and 20, Moses asked God to forgive the iniquity of the Israelites because of the greatness of God's love. After hearing this passionate plea from Moses, God relents. God changes God's mind and said, I do forgive, just as you have asked. It was this passionate plea that changes God's mind. Where God was ready to completely wipe out this nation, God is now ready to forgive only because Moses pleaded on their behalf. Wouldn't it be great if we all had a Moses to plead on our behalf? The good news is that we do. Jesus is seated at the right hand of God, making intercession for us, even now. So let's give the text some context. Synonyms for advocate include terms like promoter, backer, proponent, campaigner, supporter, and defender, among others. Whatever you want to call it, we all need some of it in our lives. We need people that'll see the best in us despite our current faults and failures. We need people who will love us fiercely despite our not being very lovable at the moment. Advocates understand that despite your current situation or circumstances, there is a better way. There is a better system. There is a better you. And that we are all made better when you're better. Despite their rejection of God, and despite the people complaining against Moses and Aaron, Moses chose to fight for a better Israelite nation. We should do the same in our own families, in our own communities, in our own states, and especially in this, our own nation. Let's be somebody's Moses. Key characters in the text. The key character in this text is, of course, beside God, Moses. Moses, a good definition for Moses, is the first great leader of the Hebrew people, regarded by some as the author of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Moses is revered by Jews, Christians, and Muslims for his daring leadership and diplomacy, as well as his promulgation of the divine law. Key words, not necessarily in the text, but good for discussion. One would be advocate, and an advocate is one who pleads the cause of another. And fidelity. Fidelity is defined as the quality or state of being faithful. The fidelity of God is shown in God's dependability, trustworthiness, and reliability. Themes, topics, discussion, or sermon preparation ideas. One might be, you need to get a Moses. A second might be, just because you don't believe it doesn't mean it isn't true. That's a repeat from last week, but I think it's suitable for this week as well. Questions. One question might be, did God really change God's mind? Or was God seriously going to kill the entire nation of Israel? Discuss whether it's possible for an all-knowing God to change God's mind. And a second question might be, God is a fierce advocate. Moses is a fierce advocate for the Israelites. What people or causes should we become fierce advocates for? And then a concluding thought. You've probably heard someone say, he or she is getting on my last nerve. That's where the people of Israel were with God. God had had enough of their foolishness and just wasn't going to take it anymore. Because Moses stepped in to remind God of God's love and mercy, God forgave the nation and relented from destroying them. Perhaps we need to be Moseses, or perhaps we need to be the Moses in someone's life. Moses was a great advocate, but Jesus is the ultimate advocate. And a preview of next week's lesson. Next week, the lesson remains in the Pentateuch, but moves to the book of Deuteronomy. Next week, I'll discuss how God provided the commandments and how God expects us to follow the commandments in obedient faith. God expects our obedience. We continue in the theme of responses to God's faithfulness. Next week's lesson is entitled Obedient Faith. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I am Reverend Dexter Alexander, and you've been listening to SundaySchoolPreacher.com. The only way I know this is helpful is if you subscribe, click the like button, or say so in the comments. Please also click the notifications bell so you'll be notified as soon as I upload next week's lesson. And if you don't mind, please share this site with other Sunday school teachers, preachers, and students. Thank you, and may God bless you real good.